Sometimes it's just good to be reminded that at the end of the day, whatever you're doing, be it a service or a product, there is someone at the end using it. And why is this thing existing in the first place? It's the very first part of understanding and empathy. Yeah.
Welcome to Stuck in Design, where our founders share candid conversations about design, creativity, and business. Let's begin.
Is design thinking for everyone?
Yes, I think so. I think design thinking is actually suitable for everybody. It's just a way of thinking or process or methodology that designers use in their day-to-day. But if you break it down into the phases or the benefits of it, actually it's very suitable for everybody. Because the stages, we inevitably have to talk about the stages of design thinking then. That there's the part where you have to understand people, create empathy, and through understanding, frame up questions or things that would be beneficial and relevant to them. So that's the very first phase of the design thinking process, right? To understand and create empathy. We can go a little bit deeper into that, but then it's the basic fundamental is to understand the person or the user, so to speak, in a design sense, and subsequently coming up with relevant questions or problems that you should be addressing. So I think the very first lesson in design has always been, are you asking the right questions, right? Before you invest the time into solving a problem, are you actually asking the right problem? And that initial phase of empathy and understanding will help to define the right problem. And then the second stage, actually, the creative stage, where you start coming up with solutions. What I think is very relevant to everybody is because, number one, you need to understand, like, let's say, even in let's say, planning a trip or a travel trip for your parents, for example, or planning an activity for your kid, or planning something for yourself. You need to understand the user, and it could be your parents as the user, the kid as the user, or yourself as the end user. So when that happens, you can understand what they need at that time. So it's contextualized, it's relevant. With that, then you ask the right questions like, should I then go for a cruise because they don't maybe like to walk too much, or they like to have it contained and easy for my parents, for example. Or should I engage in more hands-on activity for my kid because he's at a stage now where he needs to maybe explore a little bit more about his psychomotor skills and activity-based learning. So that kind of understanding and questioning forms up the basis or the framework to find solutions. That's when you start looking for the right cruise, the kind of cruise that will fit them. But you're looking for something like a cruise, right? And for the kid, you're looking for some sort of hands-on activity. Then you start problem solving or coming up with creative solutions like, should I use materials from at home? Should I start buying from Carousel or buying online? So that goes into the next stage of creativity. And I think the design thinking process is to help you come up with a lot of solutions from multiple angles based on the question and framing. Then that naturally goes into the next stage where you start prototyping and then testing and improving. So in this case, let's say the travel example, you could prototype it by just showing your parents the itinerary or the website of the cruise ship, or the activities that happens on the cruise ship, and you could test it with different multiple versions. You could go with this particular cruise provider. You go with another one and say, maybe you don't like cruise. Okay, let's So that's where your parents might feedback and say, actually, we've been to cruise last year. Can we try something different? So okay, let's go for a staycation, or let's go for a Club Med, whatever, and then you start prototyping again, collecting the information, coming with the solution, the package, and then trying to show it to your parents and say, how about this? Is this good? Is this timing good? And you get feedback and you iterate and you improve on it. So that's similarly for the kid as well, right? You could just try out a little activity at home to see if he's responding well. If he does well, you could go a little bit deeper into developing a solution, like for example, engaging him in a longer time frame activity, or making a routine. So you do prototype and you test and you kind of gauge the feedback, and that's essentially the whole design thinking process.
Actually, it sounds like it is something that maybe people do a bit of in their everyday life, but they might not actually see it through the lens of a design thinking process or as explicitly labeled. So I was wondering whether for people who, like maybe the examples that you mentioned, could you share how they can think of it in the design thinking way, or see that design thinking process a bit clearer? Yeah, and how it might help them.
For non-designers or?
Yeah, for non-designers.
I see. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, it's actually a very natural thing we do, but putting it into a framework and process just helps to kind of structure it so that it can you can train to do it if you are not familiar with it, or you don't practice it often, or you don't even know you're practicing it. So sometimes to designers, the term design thinking seems rather obvious, right? Like, hey, I've been doing it in my own practice, but that's because of the nature of the work that designers engage in. They need to understand, create, test, and before they eventually roll out and improve on it and roll out, right? So for non-designers, I think it's just a matter of understanding the fundamental mindset behind it. So you don't really need tools. You don't really need very sophisticated things. You know, it's really just about understanding who the person is, and it could be yourself. So sometimes that framework or that process can be applied on yourself. Like, okay, which school should I go to? Then you need to understand yourself a little bit, what you're interested in, blah blah blah. You know, then you go through the process of, you know, coming up with different solutions, like studying overseas, here, part-time, full-time, you know, coming up with different solutions, and you could test it as well, right? Half working, half studying, you could test it out as well. So I think it's just embracing that mindset of understanding the end user, and then subsequently coming up with multiple variations of solutions, and then testing a few of the more potential or the ones that resonate a little bit more. So testing the ideas out by prototyping or making it a little bit more concrete, I think, and then just improving based on the test. So that's as simple as I think it is for design thinking.
Could you give two different scenarios where design thinking can play a part in, maybe two very different disciplines, just to give a contrast of?
Discipline, I think I think in terms of product development, let's say from an engineering perspective, or rather, if you look for extremes or different value chain of the whole kind of service or product rollout or development phase, right? I think the ones that will benefit a lot from design thinking will be areas where you don't directly work with the end consumers. So that's where you're kind of siloed, or you might be over time, because of the nature of work, be separated from the end user. So having a sense of refresh of design thinking, using it as a process to even, you know, think of, okay, I'm building this feature, you know, like the waterfall kind of process, you know, in app development, or I'm building this feature, you know, I'm building this thing and it's trickled down here, and I've got different work streams, you know, I need to do this, I need to do that. But at the end of the day, I think it's good to just take a step back and say, why am I doing this? You know, who am I designing for? And that's the very first step of design thinking, is to understand and have empathy for the end user. And you might not get access to the end user, but it might be just good to clarify with your different departments or your, you know, team, right? Or if it's a mixed discipline team, and you could say, hey, why are we doing this in the first place? Can I understand the motivation and nature of the feature? So I could then program it or code it in a way that it fits as well. So that becomes a very healthy discussion, and you always make sure whatever you're doing is beneficial to the eventual user. Then I think because it's called design thinking, but actually it's a very fundamental and normal thing that we do. Sometimes along the way, as we silo ourselves into industries and practices, right, you kind of forget, like a lawyer needs to, and I'm sure they do, you know, a doctor, a lawyer, they practice different ways of design thinking. They need to understand their client, they need to understand their patient, and sometimes it's just good to be reminded that at the end of the day, whatever you're doing, be it a service or a product, there is someone at the end using it. Even if you're building a robot, you know, there is someone at the end using it, or, you know, benefiting from it. And why is this thing existing in the first place? It's the very first part of understanding and empathy. Yeah. I mean, naturally, there are business considerations like productivity, technological advances, political advantages, strategic reasons that this product might exist. But at the end of the day, there is going to be an end user. And it depends on where you want to play the end user role, right? The end user could be the board members of the company, because they will benefit strategically from this, and how would they do it? And then you could then package out that solution or strategy or product to fit that end user's motivations and goal. The end users could be eventually people who actually use the product. That's typically for a lot of product designers, the end users are the people using the products. So you could have multiple users of a solution, multiple stakeholders, they would call it. And so I think that's like, if you really expand the design thinking framework, you're not only looking at the eventual user. That's only if you come from a value-driven perspective that whatever I want to create in terms of service or product has to be valuable to people. That's from a very value, people-centric perspective. But you could also be a stakeholder-centric perspective. Because design thinking, I mean, the broad term of it is human-centered. And human can be a business stakeholder, it can be a political stakeholder, it can be a social stakeholder, it could be the user stakeholder, so to speak. So there's multiple different stakeholders as well. It could be operator as a stakeholder, right?
Okay. So just now you're mentioning the example was from a product development, product development standpoint. Is there another maybe contrasting?
Sales, service. Service standpoint would be, it's quite funny. I mean, I was just walking towards here to the meeting room here, right? And a person is asking for a survey. It's a door-to-door cold call survey, right? And I mean, we've never met before, right? And he's at the door, and when you open the door, or when I opened the door just now, immediately it was a bullet of things coming up from him. Like, it was, we're doing this survey for who, and if you scan it here, you can do the survey, I'll come back and give you a voucher later, blah, blah, blah. And, this is, I mean, it's a service, right? I mean, it's a door-to-door service. And as much as it is, as an end user, what I'm getting is, I'm not being understood at all, right from the start. And regardless he's trying to sell something or giving a service or experience, right? I'm not being understood at all, because the person is coming out from my office, and the first thing he didn't ask was, or maybe it should have been asked was, do you have 5 minutes? You look, we are rushing somewhere, but do you have 5 minutes? And how long the survey is going to take, and how much time I need from you? If not, can I come back another time? This would come from a very user-centric perspective, where you understand the person. So I mean, very good examples of sales and service people is whenever you enter a shop, right? They would always try to understand what you need first in a way. Maybe it's also understanding that people who go into the shop might not want to be disturbed immediately, so they will sometimes observe first. So you can see different methods of working, and that solutioning, that say deciding to say I approach you this way, or I wait 5 minutes before I approach you, I call you up first, or when I meet you, I actually state my purpose or how long I'm going to need from you. It's a different solutioning, but that coming up with understanding that someone might have different need and everybody is different is actually quite human-centered. So going to a shop, I appreciate salesperson who observe and see if this person likes to browse first or is looking around for an answer and then approaches you. So he's kind of very human-centered, like person-centered, right? Like he's looking at you and saying, what do you really need? And therefore I provide different forms of solutioning. Rather than I have a template, I'm going to come up to you and this is what I'm going to sell you and this is my speech. Then that's very sales-centered or very process-centered. So it's not human-centered. Yeah, so that's another example where design thinking can really help. If you don't need to go through that complex methodology, but you just sit down and say, what does that person really need, and maybe observe a little bit. That would be really helpful, really.
Yeah, actually, just now what you mentioned actually reminded me of this Grab ride that I was having just yesterday. So I was on the way to NUH, right? And then the Grab driver, after I ordered the Grab, he called saying or he saw that I was on the way to the hospital. Maybe you want to cancel the order because there was a jam on the way to the hospital. So I thought that was quite nice.
Yeah, it was nice.
It's not just telling the end user the benefits you're trying to bring him, is empathizing with the person, what the person actually needs. So maybe the person actually doesn't have time to listen to you, then just don't force it in that sense lah.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, that's why I think it's beneficial overall, because at the day after he explained to me for like 5 minutes or so, and I had to say, I'm sorry, actually I was rushing for a meeting, and because I asked him how long it takes, he said 20 minutes. I'm rushing for a meeting, and you can try some of my other colleagues, which if he had asked me right from the start, do you have 20 minutes? I would say, I'm sorry, I don't have, but maybe my colleagues have. It would have saved him 5 minutes of his time. And if every door that he knocks, it saves him 5 minutes, I think overall he will have less frustration from people, but at the same time, he will also have got a better process for himself. So I think generally, just being able to always try to empathize, and I didn't want to be too rush about with him as well, because I know he's doing door to door, which is quite tough, right? Yeah. If you apply design thinking on his side, if he applied design thinking and you apply design thinking, and even if I don't say design thinking is empathy, then I think the process of either the service or the product or just generally interaction would have been better, Yeah, would be always better, I think.
Okay, so one thing I was thinking of as you were talking about, it's like design thinking is maybe even the term design thinking very human-centered, because sometimes I might feel like, what's this like methodology that I need to follow, and it feels like, design thinking is this silver bullet to solve whatever problems that I have. So maybe if you were to rephrase design thinking to be maybe even more understandable by people, how would you do that?
I think the more accurate, and which is now becoming more commonly used, is the human-centered design process, or the human-centered innovation process, or the human-centered creation process. I think because when you use the word human-centered, it embodies a little bit more of the value and the motivation behind it. And you can see design thinking as only a method or one process or one framework to get to a sense of human-centered process. And I think that's important. Like, for example, when we did a project with the nursing home, it was people-centered care, right? So it became... it was anchored then by the value that is people-centered, or person-centered care. So it was anchored by that person. So but there's multiple ways to get to a person-centered care. There's multiple frameworks, multiple measurements, multiple methodology, right? But that person-centered care kind of example is that value is person-centric. It's person-centric, and person means one. So it's kind of nice to know that it's an individual person-centric model of care. So when you look at design thinking, sometimes engineers will say, I don't need design thinking, I'm practicing engineering, right? Or finance, I'm doing finance, why do I do design, right? But if you use it as a value-driven thing, like it's human-centered, it's about people, then it applies anywhere, everywhere. But I would think that it's a maturity of information and knowledge also, or rather the widespread adoption of vocabulary. So when you first roll out something new, you need a simpler anchor that say, okay, what is the 4 steps that I need to do, or what is the 3 things I need to do to get there, right? When you want to first roll out. And that's why I think design thinking, coined by, or popularized rather by IDEO is great, because then everybody suddenly have a very fixed way to do it. Of course, along the way, you got backlash from designers say, like we are kind of underselling or kind of repackaging things in a too simplified manner. But I think it's simplified enough so that majority of non-designers can pick that up and then practice it, and then subsequently move up the value communication that this is not just about design, it's actually human-centered. And I say, if you start with human-centered, people might get a little bit lost, right? Like, what do you mean human-centered? Like, isn't everything human-centered? So what do I do about human-centered? Isn't my legal practices human-centered? So you get a lot of debate and misalignment. But when you do a very simple framework, so we always say it's quick wins, small steps, right? It gets you towards the bigger goal of human-centered design. So I guess design thinking for me might not have been a very kind of accurate way to define design, but it was an instrumental method and communication to get us towards a more human-centered design state or process. And that's why I think a lot of times you see even in briefs or tenders, they start writing human-centered. It doesn't need to be a user journey anymore. It doesn't need to be design thinking. Although you will still see that as deliverable because that's how they understood of the methodology of getting there. Or rather a try and proven way that if I do a user journey, most likely I will get to a rather human-centered outcome because I do a user journey. Or if I do apply design thinking procedure, so to speak. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Matt, one of the hosts for Stuck in Design, and we've been working on this podcast for a couple of months now, and we really want to know what you think about it. Whether you like it or you don't like it. Please leave a comment down below on any of our platforms. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week on Stuck in Design.